There's a story that has been buried quietly inside the memory of ordinary American families for more than 50 years. It didn't make headlines. It was never taught in schools. No financial expert stood on a stage and announced it. No bank sent a newsletter about it. In fact, if anything, the people who benefited most from this story learned very quickly that keeping it quiet was the smartest thing they could do. This is the story of a woman named Ruth Calloway. She was not famous, she was not rich, she had never attended a single day of college, never opened a brokerage account, and never once sat across from a financial advisor in a glass office. She was a housewife living in a small Ohio town in 1971, raising 3 children with a husband who drove a delivery truck 6 days a week. She was ordinary in every way that people use that word. But somewhere between clipping grocery coupons and stretching a pot of soup across 3 meals, Ruth Calloway stumbled onto something that would quietly change everything about how her family lived and how they survived for decades to come. It started with a habit. A small, almost embarrassingly simple habit. Something she almost didn't tell anyone about because she was afraid people would laugh at how modest it was. But that habit, practiced quietly and consistently through some of the most financially brutal years America had ever seen, became something that people today, living in 2026, drowning in subscription fees, credit card debt, and bank charges they can barely explain, would find almost impossible to believe actually worked. Here's what makes this story feel almost dangerous to tell. The financial system as it exists today, the credit industry, the banking sector, the debt economy, was built piece by piece on the assumption that ordinary people would never do what Ruth Calloway did. And when you hear what she did, you're going to ask yourself the same question thousands of people have asked when they first learned about her story. Why didn't anyone tell me this sooner? So settle in, because this story starts in 1971 in a small house on a cracked concrete street in a Midwestern town you've probably never heard of, and it ends in a place that almost no American family reaches anymore. It ends in financial freedom. And if you are also searching for that quiet path where stories of ordinary people like Ruth unlock more secrets, now's the time to join us. Subscribe and get these stories delivered to your email, the ones that banks and advisors will never share. It's just one click away, and it could be your first step toward financial freedom. To understand why what Ruth Calloway did was so remarkable, you first have to understand the world she was living in. 1971 was not a gentle year for the American working class. The Vietnam War was still dragging on, pulling young men overseas, while inflation quietly crept into every grocery store, every gas station, every utility bill back home. President Nixon had just announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold, a decision that sent shockwaves through the entire economy, though most ordinary families had no idea what it meant at the time. All they knew was that everything was getting more expensive. The price of a loaf of bread had climbed. A pound of ground beef cost more than it had the year before. The rent on a 2-bedroom house in a working-class neighborhood, a place with 1 bathroom and a furnace that knocked all winter, had gone up without any warning and without much sympathy from the landlord. For a family like the Calloways, life ran on a very thin margin. Ruth's husband, Earl, made a decent wage for the time, but decent didn't mean comfortable. It meant covered most months. It meant the light bill got paid, and the children had shoes that fit, and the car didn't sit in the driveway broken for longer than a week or 2 at a time. There was no cushion. There was no savings account with any real money in it. There was no plan for what would happen if Earl missed a week of work, or if the furnace gave out in February, or if one of the kids needed more than what the family doctor could handle. Like millions of American families at that exact moment in history, the Callaways were one bad month away from a problem they couldn't solve. And the world around them wasn't making it easier. Credit cards were becoming more widely available, and the banks, still figuring out how to market them to regular working people, were pushing the idea that borrowing was just part of modern life, that you didn't have to wait, that you didn't have to save, that you could have it now and pay for it later. It was a seductive message, and a lot of families believed it. Ruth Callaway was not one of them. Not because she was particularly wise about finance, not because she had read some book or attended some seminar, but because something in her gut told her that money you borrowed always cost more than the thing you bought with it. And she had seen too many neighbors prove that point the hard way. Does any of this sound familiar to you? Because what American families were dealing with in 1971 looks a lot like what families are carrying today. The names of the pressures have changed, but the weight is remarkably similar. The winter of 1971 was the season that pushed Ruth Callaway to the edge. Not because of one catastrophic event. That's never how it works for working-class families. It's rarely one big disaster. It's the accumulation, the slow, grinding stack of small financial pressures that builds until it feels like you're carrying the whole thing on your back, and one more ounce will break something permanent. In November, Earl's truck needed a repair that cost 3 weeks of his take-home pay. They covered it, barely. In December, the heating oil bill came in higher than it had the previous year, which had itself been higher than the year before. They paid it in 2 installments, which meant January started short before it even began. And in January, the deep gray Ohio kind of January that feels like the world is trying to tell you something, the refrigerator started making a sound that Ruth recognized. She'd heard that sound before, in her mother's house, just before the refrigerator stopped working entirely. She sat at the kitchen table that night, after the kids were in bed, with a legal pad and a pencil, and she added up everything they owed against everything Earl would bring home in the next 60 days. The numbers didn't lie, and they weren't kind. There was no room, no slack, no place to absorb another unexpected bill without going into debt somewhere, without calling her mother, or going to the bank, or doing the thing she hated most in the world, asking. She stared at that legal pad for a long time. Now, here's the thing about Ruth Callaway that you need to understand. She was not a woman who sat with problems. She was the kind of woman who moved, who figured, who turned a chicken into 3 days of different meals and then made soup from what was left, who found the thing that most people walked past and saw exactly what it could become. So she didn't cry that night. She thought. And what she thought about, quietly, was a conversation she'd had months earlier with her mother-in-law, an older woman named Vera, who had grown up during the Depression and who had a way of talking about money that most people in 1971 considered old-fashioned. Vera had said something that stuck. She had said, "The banks don't want you to be smart. They want you to be comfortable enough to keep borrowing and scared enough to never stop." Ruth had laughed at the time, but sitting at that kitchen table in January of 1972, staring at a legal pad that told a very honest story, she stopped laughing, and she started thinking about what Vera actually meant. She was about to discover something that would not only save her family's finances, it would protect them for the next 30 years, and the seed of it had been sitting in her mother-in-law's kitchen all along. Vera Callaway lived 12 minutes away in a house that smelled like coffee and old wood and something always simmering on the stove. She was in her late 60s by then, sharp-eyed and practical in the way that people who survived the 1930s tended to be. She didn't waste words and she didn't waste money, and she looked at the financial habits of younger people, the credit cards, the installment plans, the new television on a payment plan, with the calm, unimpressed expression of someone who had already learned that lesson the hard way and had no interest in learning it again. When Ruth showed up one Tuesday morning in late January, Vera could read her before she even sat down. She poured coffee, she set out 2 cups, and she waited. Ruth explained the situation: the truck repair, the heating oil, the refrigerator, the legal pad, the numbers that didn't work. Vera listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she got up, went to the back bedroom, and came back with something Ruth had never paid much attention to before. It was a shoebox. An ordinary shoebox, a little worn at the corners, with a rubber band around it. Vera set it on the kitchen table and took the rubber band off, and when she opened the lid, Ruth saw what was inside. Envelopes. Small, plain white envelopes, each one labeled in Vera's careful handwriting. Groceries, electric, oil, repair, Christmas, shoes. And in each envelope, cash, real paper bills and coins, organized, separated, designated. Vera explained it in the plainest possible terms. Every week, on payday, she divided her household money into those envelopes. Each envelope got its assigned amount and nothing more. When the grocery envelope was empty, grocery shopping stopped. Or it got creative, working with what was already in the pantry. When the repair envelope had accumulated enough, a repair got made, not before, not on credit, not on a promise. It was a system so simple it almost seemed embarrassing to call it a system. But Vera's point was not about complexity. Her point was about control. She said, when the money is in the envelope, you can see it, you can touch it, you know exactly when it's running low. You can't do that with a bank account, because the bank account always looks like it has more in it than it really does, right up until it doesn't. Ruth sat with that for a moment. She thought about all the times she'd looked at their bank balance and felt something that wasn't exactly confident, but wasn't exactly worried either. A kind of in-between feeling. A feeling that she now understood was not the same thing as actually knowing where the money was going. She drove home that afternoon with an empty shoebox in the passenger seat, and a plan that felt for the first time in months like it might actually work. Ruth didn't start big. She started exactly the way most lasting changes start, with something small enough that failure wouldn't be catastrophic, but significant enough that success would mean something real. She picked one category: groceries. This was intentional. Groceries were the one area of the family budget where Ruth had the most direct, daily control. Earl paid the bills, filled the gas tank, handled the truck. But the grocery store was Ruth's territory, and she knew it better than any other part of their financial life. She took $25 in cash, which was what she roughly spent on groceries in a week, put it in an envelope, wrote groceries on the front in pencil, and put the envelope in the kitchen drawer where she kept the rubber bands and the scissors. Then she went to the grocery store. Now, there's a psychological phenomenon that happens when you pay for things with physical cash that does not happen when you pay with a check or a bank card. Researchers have written about it at length in the years since, but Ruth Calloway didn't need a research paper to feel it. When she pulled that envelope out at the checkout counter and counted out the bills, she felt something. A small but unmistakable resistance, a slight internal hesitation before each item went into the cart, a question, automatic, almost unconscious, of whether that item was worth the number of bills it would pull from the envelope. She put back a box of cereal she'd automatically reached for out of habit, not because she didn't want it, because when she held it and thought about the envelope, she realized it was not essential. She put back a bottle of salad dressing and remembered that she knew how to make a dressing from oil and vinegar that her children actually preferred. She stood in the meat aisle longer than usual, looking at the prices with a different kind of attention than she normally paid, the attention of someone who was holding the actual money in her actual hand, not writing a number on a check that felt somewhat abstract. She came home that first week and found she had $3.40 left in the envelope. $3.40. It doesn't sound like much, but Ruth Calloway looked at that money, looked at it the way you look at something that genuinely surprises you, and understood that this was money she had previously been spending without noticing. Money that had slipped through week after week in small, invisible amounts that never showed up anywhere as a problem because they were never large enough to notice individually, but added together over months, over years. She put the $3.40 in a different envelope, a small one she labeled with a single word, extra. And that was the beginning. By the end of February, something quiet was happening in the Calloway household that Ruth hadn't quite named yet. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of change that anyone outside the family would have noticed, but she felt it. The grocery envelope experiment had gone well enough that she'd expanded the system. She now had 7 envelopes in the kitchen drawer, each one serving a different function in the family's financial life: groceries, electric, heating, household repairs, children's clothes and shoes, church, and the small growing one she'd labeled extra. Every Friday, the day Earl got paid, Ruth sat at the kitchen table with the cash and distributed it into the envelopes. It took about 15 minutes. Earl would pour himself a coffee and watch sometimes, or he'd go into the living room and watch the news while she worked. He was skeptical in the quiet way that husbands sometimes are when their wives try something new that involves the household budget, not dismissive, just waiting to see. Ruth didn't blame him. The numbers had been tight for so long that any new plan felt like optimism, and optimism had been burned before. But she kept at it, and slowly, in the careful, unglamorous way that real financial improvement actually happens, never in a flash, always over time, things began to shift. The electric bill month felt less terrifying because there was already money waiting for it in the envelope. She didn't have to find it somewhere else. She didn't have to juggle. She didn't have to go to bed the night before the due date with that particular low-grade anxiety in her chest. The envelope had the money. The bill was paid. That was all. The month the second oldest, Danny, needed new shoes for school, Ruth had the money, right there, in the envelope. She didn't have to ask Earl, didn't have to calculate, didn't have to say, "We'll figure it out," the way families say, "We'll figure it out," when they mean, "We'll borrow it somehow and deal with the consequences later." She just went and bought the shoes. It sounds small, but if you have ever lived paycheck to paycheck, and a remarkable number of Americans have, or currently do, you understand that there is nothing small about not feeling the panic, not feeling that particular helplessness that comes with a need you can't immediately meet. By March, the extra envelope had $14 in it. By April, it had $22. Ruth started a second extra envelope. She labeled this one Future. And every time she managed to peel a dollar or two away from any category and it didn't belong in the day-to-day extras, it went into Future. She told no one about Future, not yet. She wanted to watch it grow a little first. She wanted to be sure it was real. Have you ever done something like this? Put money away somewhere just to see if it would actually stay there? Because there's something powerful about watching it accumulate that no bank statement ever quite replicated. By the summer of 1972, the envelope system had evolved into something more refined. Ruth had kept notes, not formal accounting, she wasn't trained for that and didn't pretend to be, but simple, honest observations written in a small spiral notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer alongside the envelopes. Notes about which categories consistently had money left over, which ones she was always short on, which expenses were predictable, and which ones came out of nowhere. She noticed a pattern that changed how she thought about the envelopes entirely. Every year, without fail, the same several expenses arrived in the same general months. Back-to-school shoes and clothes in August, the higher heating bill in November, the Christmas spending in December, the car registration in spring. These weren't surprises. They only felt like surprises because, until now, Ruth had treated them as surprises, scrambling for money when they arrived, rather than quietly building toward them in advance. She made a new set of envelopes. She called them the seasonal set.
Each one was labeled with the month it was meant to fund. August, back to school. November, heating. December, Christmas. April, car. Every week, when she divided the cash on Friday nights, she put a small amount into each seasonal envelope. Not much, sometimes as little as $1, sometimes 2 or 3, when the regular budget allowed for it. What happened next was so simple that she almost couldn't believe it had never occurred to her before. When August came, the back-to-school envelope had money in it. When December arrived, the Christmas envelope had enough to make the holiday feel like a real celebration rather than a financial emergency disguised as festivity. When the car registration came due in April, there was no scrambling, no borrowing, no anxiety. The money was simply there, waiting, because she had put it there, piece by piece, across the months before. Now, here's where the banks enter this story, and where Ruth's quiet little system starts to feel genuinely subversive. Because in 1972, the banking industry was beginning to push something aggressively: the personal line of credit, the revolving debt, the installment plan. The concept that when life's irregular expenses arrived, the big ones, the seasonal ones, the unexpected ones, the right move was to borrow. The bank down the street would have been glad to lend the Calloway family money for back-to-school expenses. They would have called it a small, personal loan with very reasonable terms. They would have made it feel like a service. But that loan would have cost interest. That loan would have extended the pressure. That loan would have meant that next year's budget was already partially spent before the year even began. Ruth's envelopes cost nothing. They charged no interest. They required no application. They didn't care about her credit history. They just held the money until she needed it. And for that reason, for that radical, uncomplicated, nearly invisible reason, what Ruth Calloway was doing in that Ohio kitchen in 1972 was something that the modern financial system has very little incentive to encourage.
It was Vera who pointed it out. Ruth had been so focused on the cash system itself that she had almost missed something hiding right at the edge of it. She had gone to Vera's one afternoon that fall to show her how the system had grown, the seasonal envelopes, the notebooks, the growing future fund, and Vera had listened and smiled and then asked a question. She asked, "How much does your bank charge you?" Ruth thought about it. There was the monthly fee, she knew that, a small one, a few dollars. It had always seemed negligible, the price of having an account, the cost of convenience. Vera said, "Write it down. Every single charge, every single month, add it up." So Ruth went home and did exactly that. She pulled out 3 months of bank statements, the kind that came in a plain white envelope each month and that she had been filing without reading too carefully, and she sat down with a pencil and went through them line by line. There was the monthly maintenance fee, small as she'd thought, but consistent. There was an overdraft fee from 4 months ago, from a day when a check had cleared a few hours before Earl's direct deposit arrived. One fee, one day, more than most people earned in an hour at that time. There was a minimum balance fee from a month where they'd run the account lower than usual. There was a fee for a money order she'd used to pay a bill by mail. And there were several small charges she couldn't immediately identify, amounts of 50 cents or $1 or $1.50 that appeared without explanation, buried between larger entries, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them specifically. She added it all up. In 3 months, they had paid more in bank fees than Ruth had saved in extra grocery money during the same period. She sat with that for a long, quiet moment. She wasn't angry. Anger felt like the wrong reaction. What she felt was something closer to clarity, a sudden, cold sharpening of focus. The bank was charging them for having too little money, for using their account, for existing within the system without maintaining the kind of balance that the system rewarded. The very families who needed the most help were paying the most fees. She didn't close the bank account. She wasn't that radical, and Earl's direct deposit required it. But she made a decision. She would keep the minimum required in the account, no more.
Everything that could be handled in cash, everything that could live in the envelopes, would never touch the bank at all. Every dollar that stayed in an envelope was a dollar that couldn't be skimmed by a fee she didn't see coming. It seems like a small rebellion, but multiply it across a year, multiply it across a decade, and then ask yourself, how much money have the families who trusted the modern banking system completely actually paid to own that trust? The answer for most people would be uncomfortable. By the end of 1972, something happened that Ruth had not planned for, had not predicted, and had not even allowed herself to hope for. She had real savings. Not a fortune, not a life-changing sum by any standard a banker or a financial columnist would have recognized as significant, but real, tangible, physical savings. Money that existed not as a number on a statement, but as actual cash in actual envelopes in the back of a kitchen drawer. The future envelope had grown to $63. There was a second jar on the shelf in the pantry, a wide-mouthed mason jar that had once held peaches from Vera's garden, filled with coins, the overflow from grocery shopping, the extra cents from envelope transactions, the dimes and nickels and quarters that she'd begun treating not as pocket litter, but as building material. Ruth had also quietly, and without telling Earl until she was sure, started a third accumulation. She called it the real emergency fund. Not the repair fund, not the seasonal envelope, but an actual emergency fund. Money that was not assigned to anything. Money that existed only for the things she couldn't predict. Earl found out about it in March of 1973, when the furnace, which they had been nursing along for 2 years by that point, finally stopped working in a meaningful way. They needed a repair, a significant one. Ruth told Earl to wait. She went to the kitchen. She came back with an envelope. Earl looked inside at the folded bills. He didn't say anything for a moment. He asked how long she'd been keeping this. She told him. He nodded slowly, and then he said something that Ruth would remember for the rest of her life. He said, "I thought we were behind. I didn't know we were ahead." That sentence encapsulates something important about what this kind of saving system does to a family's psychology. Because for years, the Callaways had been running what felt like a deficit, always catching up, always one step behind the needs of the household. The bank account looked adequate most months, but provided no sense of safety because there was always something waiting to take what was in it. The envelope system didn't make them wealthier overnight. What it did was give them a different relationship with the money they had. It changed what they could see. And what they could see, they could manage. And what they could manage, they could grow. By the end of 1973, the real emergency fund had just over $100 in it. It had taken nearly 2 years of patience and discipline and Friday night envelope filling to get there. And it may have been the most powerful $100 the Callaway family ever accumulated, not because of its size, but because of what its existence meant. It meant they could absorb something. For the first time since Ruth could remember, they could absorb a surprise without borrowing from someone else to do it. Can you imagine what that feeling was like after years of the alternative? Children are more perceptive than adults give them credit for. They don't always understand the specifics, the numbers, the envelopes, the decisions happening at the kitchen table on Friday nights, but they feel the atmosphere. The Callaway children, Patricia, who was 14 by 1973, and Danny and little Robert behind her, had grown up in a house where the ambient financial stress was as much a part of the background as the sound of the furnace running and the neighbor's television through the thin wall. They noticed the changes before they could name them. Patricia noticed it first, the way oldest children often do. She noticed that her mother seemed different at the grocery store, calmer, more deliberate, less hurried in the way that people are hurried when they're trying not to think too carefully about what they're doing. She noticed that her father came home on some evenings with something that wasn't quite happiness, but was close to it, a kind of settled ease that had been missing for a long time. The particular tension around the eyes that Earl Calloway had carried for years was slowly, almost imperceptibly, releasing. She noticed that the house felt different in December. Christmas of 1972 was not lavish. The Callaways didn't suddenly become wealthy. The gifts weren't expensive, but they were chosen, not desperate, bought with money that had been saved specifically for them over the course of the year, not scrambled together from whatever was left in the account after the bills were paid. Ruth and Earl gave each other something that Christmas that they hadn't had in years. A quiet evening, after the children were asleep and the gifts were under the tree, where neither of them mentioned money once. Not because they were avoiding it, but because there was nothing anxious to say. The bills were covered. The presents were paid for. The real emergency fund was intact and hadn't needed to be touched. They sat together on the sofa and watched the snow coming down outside, and Ruth thought about Vera's shoebox, about the Tuesday morning in January of the year before, when she'd driven 12 minutes to her mother-in-law's kitchen and come home with an empty box and a different way of seeing things. She thought about how small the beginning had been, how embarrassingly, almost laughably small. One envelope, $25, $3.40 left over at the end of the first week. That was the whole origin of what they now had. Not a strategy, not a plan cooked up by an expert, not a product sold to them by anyone with a financial interest in their choices, just a quiet, practical habit. The habit of seeing money, really seeing it, holding it, counting it, assigning it a purpose before it could slip away unnoticed. Danny asked his mother that Christmas why she seemed happy in a different way than usual. Ruth looked at her son and thought about how to explain it to a 12-year-old. She said, "We know where everything is this year." He nodded as if that made sense, and in every way that mattered, it did. The year 1974 arrived with two things that would have shattered the Calloway family's finances if they had lived, as they had before, without a net. The first was the oil embargo. If you know your American history, you know what that meant for ordinary families in 1973 and into 1974. Lines at gas stations that stretched around the block, heating oil prices that spiked beyond anything most families had budgeted for, the sudden, brutal, real-world cost of an economy built on cheap energy, discovering that cheap energy wasn't guaranteed. The second was Earl's back. He had been driving that delivery truck for years, and years of lifting and loading and sitting in a vibrating cab on roads that weren't always smooth had quietly done their work. In February of 1974, Earl's back went out badly enough that he couldn't drive, couldn't lift, could barely get dressed in the morning without help. He was off work for 11 weeks. 11 weeks. For a family living on the financial edge, a family with no savings, no buffer, no system, 11 weeks without income would have been a catastrophic, relationship-altering, possibly home-losing disaster. This was the moment that the Calloway envelope system was built for, though Ruth hadn't known that when she started it. She had started it to feel less anxious on a Tuesday morning when she was looking at bills that didn't add up. She hadn't started it for something like this, but it held. The real emergency fund covered 3 weeks of their most essential bills. Not everything, not luxuries, not extras, but the lights, the heat, the groceries at the bare minimum, the mortgage payment that was the thing Ruth was most afraid of missing. The seasonal envelopes had been fed all winter and contained money designated for spring expenses that hadn't arrived yet. Ruth quietly reassigned those funds. Spring could wait. Earl's recovery came first. The grocery envelope tightened. Ruth did things she hadn't done since she was a young bride learning to cook, stretched a chicken across a week, made bread from scratch because it was cheaper than buying it, used dried beans as the foundation of meals that she made different enough that the children didn't complain. She called her mother once in the third week, and her mother offered to help. Ruth thanked her and said they were managing. And they were. Not comfortably, not without sacrifice, but they were managing without borrowing, without going to the bank for a loan, without calling their landlord with a story, without putting anything on the credit card that would haunt the next year's budget. When Earl went back to work in May, they had drawn the savings down significantly, but they had not added any debt, not a dollar. Ruth refilled the envelopes slowly over the summer and fall. By Christmas of 1974, they were back to where they'd been. And Earl, who had been quietly watching his wife's system for 2 years with the respectful skepticism of a man who wasn't sure it would matter, sat down at the kitchen table on a Friday night in November and asked her to show him how to do it. He wanted to understand the envelopes. He wanted to be part of it. That was the real turning point. Not the crisis, not the recovery, but the moment Earl Calloway pulled his chair up to the table and said, "Teach me."
You might be wondering why, if this system worked so well, if it genuinely protected ordinary families from financial disaster in an era of real economic turmoil, you've never heard about it. Why didn't it spread? Why didn't it become the standard advice in every personal finance book, every newspaper column, every radio program aimed at working-class households? The answer is complicated, but at its core, it comes down to this. The systems that replaced it were more profitable for the people selling them. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, America underwent a fundamental transformation in its relationship with money. Credit cards, which had once been the domain of businesses and the wealthy, became aggressively marketed to the middle class. The banking deregulation of the early 1980s opened new opportunities for fees and interest rates that had previously been capped. The culture slowly, consistently, powerfully shifted from one built on the idea that you saved before you spent to one built on the idea that you spent now and figured it out later. The cash envelope system, the shoebox in Vera's bedroom, the Friday night ritual at Ruth's kitchen table was fundamentally incompatible with that shift. You cannot spend on a credit card from a cash envelope. You cannot accumulate revolving debt when you've already assigned every dollar to a specific purpose before it has a chance to drift. You cannot be sold a personal loan for a seasonal expense if you've been quietly saving for that expense all year. The people who used envelope systems were bad customers for the financial products that were becoming increasingly central to how the banking and credit industries made their money. They didn't need overdraft protection because they kept only minimum balances in their accounts. They didn't need installment plans because they bought things when the relevant envelope had enough money in it. They didn't carry credit card balances because they rarely needed to borrow for the things the envelopes covered. So the system didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because the culture around it changed in ways that made it feel old-fashioned, inconvenient, overly cautious, the relic of a Depression-era mentality that didn't suit the modern consumer. People were told in 1,000 subtle and not-so-subtle ways that handling physical cash was unsophisticated, that organizing your money into labeled envelopes was the kind of thing your grandmother did, that real financial management meant accounts and cards and statements, and, if you were really doing it right, investment portfolios. The shoebox went into the attic. And for most American families, the result has been 50 years of revolving debt, cascading fees, insufficient emergency savings, and the particular financial anxiety that comes from never quite being able to see where the money is going. Ruth Calloway never moved the shoebox to the attic. She kept it in the kitchen until she passed it on to Patricia when she married in 1981.
Patricia kept it in her own kitchen until 2003, when she finally gave it to her daughter, who put it on a shelf with the kind of fond, distant affection that people have for things they appreciate without quite believing they need. Then 2008 happened, and her daughter moved the shoebox back to the kitchen table and started a Friday night habit that had never actually stopped working. Here is the thing about financial principles that are genuinely rooted in human psychology. They don't expire. The specific circumstances change. The prices are different. The technology is different. The economy has transformed in ways that Ruth Calloway, sitting at her 1972 kitchen table with 7 envelopes and a pencil, could never have imagined. But the fundamental dynamics, the psychology of spending, the invisibility of digital money, the way that debt accumulates silently, and the way that savings grow quietly, those things are not artifacts of the 1970s. They are as present in 2026 as they were when Nixon was in the White House and the price of heating oil was making Ohio families desperate. Consider this. Research consistently shows that people spend more when paying with cards, physical or digital, than when paying with cash. The friction of handing over physical money, of watching the envelope thin out, creates a natural hesitation that digital payment systems are specifically engineered to eliminate. Your phone tap at a coffee shop register is designed to feel like nothing. That design is intentional. It is not neutral. It is built to reduce the moment of resistance that keeps spending in check. The envelope system restores that moment of resistance. It makes money visible and tangible at the exact point where the spending decision is made. That is not an old-fashioned idea. That is a timeless principle applied to a very specific modern vulnerability. Consider something else. The modern financial landscape is, in important ways, more complicated and more extractive than what Ruth Calloway was navigating in 1972. There are subscription services that charge automatically and often. There are bank fees that have not decreased since Ruth found them in her statements. They have multiplied and diversified. There are overdraft systems that can turn a $10 mistake into a $35 fee. There are minimum balance requirements and account maintenance charges and out-of-network ATM fees and foreign transaction fees and, if you carry a credit card balance, interest rates that would have seemed usurious by any standard Ruth's generation recognized. The financial system has become, in its fine print, significantly more efficient at extracting money from ordinary households than it was 50 years ago. Which means the protective logic of the cash envelope system, keep money visible, keep it assigned, keep it away from systems that charge you for using it, is arguably more relevant now than it was then, not less. You don't need a shoebox, you don't need to reject every modern financial tool, but the core habit, the Friday night ritual, the purposeful assignment of money before it drifts, that is available to anyone, right now. Today. The question isn't whether it works. The question is whether we've been convinced over the past 50 years that it doesn't. And who exactly benefits from us believing that? We live in a world saturated with financial advice. There are podcasts and YouTube channels and best-selling books and Instagram accounts and certified financial planners and robo-advisors and apps designed to track your spending and apps designed to invest your spare change and apps designed to help you visualize your goals and many apps designed to make you feel like you're managing your money even when you're not quite sure what you're managing. We have access to more financial information and more financial tools than any generation in human history. And yet, the average American household carries thousands of dollars in credit card debt. The majority of American adults could not cover a $400 emergency without borrowing or selling something. The personal savings rate, the percentage of income that households actually set aside, has been, for most of the past 2 decades, historically low. There is a gap, a significant, troubling, nationally relevant gap between how much financial information we have and how financially secure most ordinary families actually are. Ruth Calloway had almost no financial information in 1972. She had not read a single book on personal finance. She had no app, no advisor, no podcast, no column in the Sunday paper. She had a shoebox and a mother-in-law who had survived the Depression and a very clear sense that she could not afford to keep not understanding where the money was going. And she built something that worked. Something that protected her family through an oil crisis and a recession and 11 weeks of her husband being unable to work and all the ordinary, grinding, invisible financial pressures that fill a life. She built it with envelopes and cash and a pencil and a Friday night habit. This isn't an argument against modern financial tools. It isn't a claim that the 1970s were simpler or better, or that we should all abandon digital banking and live exclusively on cash. It's an argument about attention, about the power of actually seeing where your money goes, not through an app that shows you a pie chart after the fact, but through the physical act of dividing and assigning before the spending happens. It's an argument about resistance, about the value of that small hesitation, that moment of pause when you reach for an envelope and can see how much is in it and ask yourself whether this purchase is worth the space it will take. It's an argument that the most sophisticated financial strategy available to a working-class family in 2026 might not be a new app or a refined investment allocation. It might be a drawer full of envelopes and a commitment to Friday night. Do you think the families around you would believe that? Would your friends take it seriously if you suggested it? And more importantly, would you? Because the interesting thing about Ruth Calloway's story is not that it's unusual, it's that it's entirely replicable by anyone with almost no resources right now. The shoebox is available. The envelopes cost almost nothing. The habit is free. Ruth Calloway lived to be 84 years old. She spent the last years of her life in the house she and Earl had owned outright since 1989, paid off early, quietly, without ceremony. The mortgage retired ahead of schedule because of years of discipline and a habit that began with $25 and one grocery envelope in a kitchen drawer in 1972. Earl outlived her by 2 years. He died in a house with no mortgage, no credit card debt, no outstanding loans of any kind. He died in the house where his children had grown up, surrounded by the kind of material stability that looks, from the outside, like wealth, but is actually something more durable than wealth. It is freedom. The freedom to not owe, the freedom to not be afraid, the freedom that comes from having built, over decades, a life that the next unexpected thing cannot fully dismantle. Patricia, their oldest, raised her own children in a household where Friday night envelope filling was as normal as dinner and homework, where money was something you could see and touch and discuss plainly, where the arrival of a seasonal bill did not create a crisis because it had been anticipated, funded, and prepared for months in advance. Patricia's children learned the system the same way Patricia had learned it, by sitting at the kitchen table and watching, by asking questions, by eventually pulling up a chair and filling their own envelopes. The shoebox passed down through the family like something between an heirloom and a philosophy, a practice, a way of being in relationship with money that the modern financial world had no incentive to teach and every incentive to discourage. When Patricia's daughter, Ruth's granddaughter, moved it back to the kitchen table after 2008, she didn't do it because she was nostalgic. She did it because the thing she'd been doing instead hadn't worked. The apps and the credit cards and the digital banking that she'd been told was modern and sophisticated and sufficient had not protected her. The envelopes did. Here is what Ruth Calloway understood, almost by accident, in 1972 that the financial industry has spent 50 years and billions of dollars in marketing trying to make ordinary people forget. You do not need a complex system to protect your family's finances. You need visibility. You need discipline. You need to assign your money a purpose before the world assigns it one for you. You need to see the envelope thin out and ask yourself one more time whether this purchase is worth it. That hesitation, that moment of genuine thought between wanting something and having it, is worth more than any financial product ever sold. It was worth more in 1972 when Ruth sat at her kitchen table with 7 envelopes and a pencil, and it is worth more in 2026 when the average family has more access to information and more exposure to financial risk than any generation before them. The habit is still available. The shoebox is still there, waiting on a shelf somewhere, patient and uncomplicated and entirely free. The question is the same one Ruth asked herself on a January night in Ohio, 50 years ago, staring at a legal pad that told an honest story. What are you going to do with what you know? Because knowing is not enough. Ruth knew she was in trouble before she drove to Vera's kitchen that morning. What changed wasn't her knowledge. What changed was her action. Small, practical, consistent, quiet. An envelope and a habit and a Friday night and 50 years of proof. The story of Ruth Calloway is not really about the past. It is about right now. It is about you. And it is about what becomes possible when you stop letting your money disappear and start watching it grow, slowly, honestly, one envelope at a time. Leave a comment below and tell us, could you do this? Could your family live this way, even for 90 days? Because every person who has tried it, really tried it, has said the same thing afterward. They said they wished they had started sooner.